Buenos días a todas, todos, todes. Gracias. Les damos la bienvenida a la segunda mesa del ciclo de conversaciones sobre raza, racismo y antropología biológica, en la que tendremos el gusto de escuchar una nueva conversación entre el doctor Francisco Vergara Silva y en este caso el profesor Alan Goodman. Quisiera darles nada más algunas indicaciones técnicas para la sesión de hoy, puesto que contamos con el servicio de traducción simultánea para poder escuchar esta conversación en su idioma original o en español. En la parte inferior de la barra de Zoom van a poder ver un icono de un globo que dice interpretación o interpretation, y ahí le pueden picar para elegir si quieren escuchar esta conversación en su idioma original, en español, en inglés completamente, o simplemente pueden activar y desactivar las opciones conforme las necesiten a lo largo de estas 2 horas de conversación. Entonces, cualquier duda, ustedes saben que pueden dejárnosla en el chat. Y para las personas que nos acompañan desde YouTube, también les damos la bienvenida. Y recuerden que cualquier duda, comentario, yo lo puedo leer y rescatar y traerlo a la sesión para que podamos tener esta conversación en varios canales y en este caso de manera bilingüe. Entonces, pues muchísimas gracias por su asistencia y le doy la palabra al doctor Francisco para conducir el evento.
Thank you very much, Jimena. Welcome everyone to, as Jimena said, the second part of this cycle of conversations on race, racism, and biological anthropology. This time, I am really pleased to welcome Professor Alan Goodman, who is already with us. He works at Hampshire College. Hampshire College is located in Amherst, Massachusetts, not too far from Boston, and therefore not too far from the Atlantic Ocean, which is nice. Alan teaches and writes on the health and nutritional consequences of political economic processes such as poverty, inequality, and racism. And his current research includes projects on malnutrition in Mexico and Egypt and the stresses of slavery in New York. Before Alan started to work at Hampshire, he received his PhD from the University of Massachusetts, and he was also a postdoctoral fellow in international nutrition at the University of Connecticut, and a research fellow in stress physiology at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. Alan has also been the dean of the faculty at Hampshire's, and he has also been president of the American Anthropological Association, AAA. And as he will tell us, among other things, he continues to co-direct the AAA's public education project on race, understandingrace.org, which is connected to at least one of the 2 books that he has recently published with colleagues. And this is going to be mostly part of the subjects that Alan will cover today, and probably many other things that we will see in a few minutes. So, Alan, many thanks again for coming, for accepting this invitation. And as they say, the floor or the screen is yours.
Gracias a todos. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. It's 12 o'clock on the East Coast in the United States. And I wish I were in Mexico City. I'll say something about coming to Mexico with Unesco in November. Remind me, Francisco, if I forget to say that, and
sure.
Be here. I think I'm just going to start in with my slides, and I'll do some introductory remarks with the first couple of slides. So I'm going to try to screen share, and hopefully the translation will work out. Entiendo español, pero es mucho mejor hablar en inglés. Okay. Good to go. Okay. Can everybody see slides okay? Good. Okay. So I want to say a couple things about my title. Firstly, it's steps toward an anti-racist science. And I think if we get to an anti-racist science, which we're not there yet, there's an impact on society, and that's a major assumption of this talk. So I want to talk, there are lots of histories of scientific racism, but nobody has very much focused on efforts to fight scientific racism. So I want to do a bit of an outline there, and pay tribute to those individuals who have been at the forefront of anti-racist science. But the subtitle of my talk is The 9 Lives of a Discredited Scientific Idea, because as we know, there is still a lot of racism in science and racist beliefs, specifically about human biology. The figure in the middle is just a turtle holding up a flat world. We know that the world, or most of us know that the world is no longer flat. That's an idea that's been put on the scrap heap of dead scientific ideas. And of course, the idea that a biological race should be put on that scrap heap, but it hasn't quite been put there yet. So there are really two purposes to this talk. One is to pay honor to, I'll talk about 9 anti-scientific steps. And then the second is to also at the same time consider why this idea of race as genetics continues and what to do about it. The two pictures are just examples. One is Asian versus Caucasian here, an advertisement. What's the difference? You know, that we see this racialization all the time. And of course, just 2 days ago, well, last week, there's a deadly shooting in the United States in Buffalo that was racially motivated. And so, you know, that scientific use of race, I think, feeds into public and societal racism. So what is then an anti-racist science? And I'll simply say it's the idea, or could say theory or worldview, that humans do not have subspecies or races or types. And that is important because it acknowledges that the idea of biological race was created to justify racism, specifically slavery and colonization, and the racism in the form of slavery and colonization. That inequalities then are not due to the biological differences, but to social race and racism. And if you can see that it's not showing up totally on my slide, but this is just a graph. Francisco, can you see the graph okay?
No, somehow the graph is not shown in my screen, but your voice is still clearly heard.
Okay. Any better now? Because this may happen again.
No, I still can't see the image.
You can or can't?
No, I can't.
Okay. Maybe let me see if I can do any sort of adjustment.
Sure, go ahead.
So, well, I'll see if I can do it, and then if it continues. Sorry.
Okay, Alan, no problem.
Sorry, everybody. Just the graphic image is just of the differences in wealth among races in the United States. socially defined races. And of course, those inequalities are found almost everywhere by demographic race or social race, including health and wealth. What are my assumptions? A couple assumptions here, working points that we would love to talk about. The first is that anti-racism has failed in part because it's avoided the science. Most people who are confess towards anti-racism believe strongly, don't understand the science or have avoided the science. And I think that's a problem of kind of a deeper anti-racism. As well, I think better science, stopping the reification of race as genetics will lead to more precise and useful understanding of human biological variation. And finally, getting the science right, I think, is a necessary step to fighting racial justice. It's not the only thing, but I think it's necessary. It's an important part of it.
Alan, just a quick remark. Can you go to the next slide? Because I think the ideas that you just developed now correspond to the next slide in the PowerPoint. Can you advance the PowerPoint presentation?
I just did to this slide with Darwin, or this next?
Yeah, we are, or at least I am still seeing only the slide that says anti-racist science is as a main heading. But I know that there is the next slide speaks about the assumptions that you just mentioned about better science, anti-racism, and getting the science right isn't necessary but not sufficient in the fight for racial justice.
So are you not seeing a slide that says assumptions at the top?
No, not now.
That's totally weird. I think let's stop. I'm going to stop the screen share and start all over.
Yeah, that could be a good solution.
Professor, I can also share the presentation, and you
exactly.
You can tell me like next.
Exactly. Alternatively, we can manage the presentation and you just tell us next.
Okay, why don't we do that? I made a few changes, but they're very inconsequential. So
okay, great.
I'm so sorry that's
no problem. We all have the slides, so we can do that. Jimena, do you want to share?
Yes, I will. Okay. Give me just a second, and maybe if you can go on, Professor, I'll be there very soon.
Well, I can just because so the first, as Jimena catches up, is a slide of Charles Darwin and the origins of evolutionary theory. And I want to call that to your attention as a step that could have been taken to fight racism, scientific racism. But yeah, thank you. So there's the three assumptions. So next slide, please. Yeah, so as I said, Darwin is, I would call a missed opportunity. What was missed is that the idea that races were unchanging types was challenged by evolutionary theory and Darwin and Wallace in particular. But because they had little data on human variation, questionable commitments to justice, Darwin was anti-slavery, but still believed, I think, in the inequality of races. And there were no non-racial language, no way to describe human variation other than to use race. And this is something you'll see over and over again. And a very famous quote from Darwin from The Voyage of the Beagle that many people have kind of discussed: if the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sin. So next slide, please. Yeah, so the first four steps are really four individuals that I want to pay homage to. All of them believe that race is biologically real, but they counter a hegemonic idea of that race is deep.
Creo que el profesor se desconectó por algún problema de conexión.
Sí, yo también perdí la conexión. Lo esperamos, ¿no? Que regrese.
Por supuesto.
Muy bien.
Aquí estamos.
Aquí estamos.
Evelia, ¿tienes alguna pregunta? Sí, puedes aprovechar.
Hola, buenos días. Les decía que apenas me estoy enterando del ciclo, que si podrían compartir el programa para siguientes ocasiones.
Sí, tenemos, si quieres, yo le contesto rápidamente, Jimena. Tenemos una tercera y última sesión de esta edición del ciclo. Es la primera vez que SURXE auspicia este ciclo con esta configuración específica. Y de hecho, nuestra invitada para la próxima semana está aquí presente, es la doctora Lumila Menéndez de Argentina, que actualmente trabaja en Alemania y en Austria. Entonces, ella dentro de 2 semanas y fracción nos va a acompañar el día 10 de junio, para ser precisos, a las 11 de la mañana, también con el mismo horario que tuvimos hoy. ¿Alguien dice en el chat que no se escucha mi voz? ¿Es cierto? ¿Debo hablar más fuerte? ¿Sí se escucha?
No, no es eso, es que si están, ¿ya? Si
Okay.
están oyendo el canal de inglés y estás hablando en español, tal vez.
Muy bien. Bueno, yo aprovecho para mencionarles que también, como lo decíamos hace rato, pero muy brevemente, una de las razones para invitar al profesor Goodman esta mañana es porque él recientemente ha publicado 2 libros que están teniendo repercusión en los Estados Unidos acerca de los temas que trata el ciclo de conversaciones, ¿no? Específicamente, quisiera empezar con el primer libro. Es realmente la segunda edición de un libro que ha sido muy influyente en la discusión en los Estados Unidos desde hace varios años, porque la primera edición fue publicada hace ya varios años, que se llama Race, Are We So Different? La traducción al español sería algo así como Raza, ¿somos tan diferentes? Entonces, ese es un libro, es una obra que proviene de un trabajo que Alan hizo con Yolanda Moses y con Joseph Jones, que tuvo que ver originalmente con una exposición itinerante auspiciada por la AAA, por la American Anthropological Association, acerca del tema de raza, ¿no? Entonces, realmente, como sabemos, la mayor parte de nosotros interesados en estos temas en México, en los Estados Unidos realmente el pensamiento racial ocupa, digamos, todos los escenarios posibles, desde la discusión pública sobre asuntos de interés colectivo hasta asuntos incluso muy especializados, incluso en disciplinas académicas, ¿no? Muchos científicos sociales, incluso, no digamos también algunos o varios especialistas en diferentes áreas de las ciencias de la vida, por ejemplo, piensan en términos raciales. Entonces, ese contraste precisamente, especialmente cuando introducimos a la antropología biológica justo como una de esas subdisciplinas que pueden o no estar hablando de raza o criticando nociones antiguas de raza, ese es precisamente el contexto en el cual para nosotros era muy interesante tenerlo en esta ocasión. Alan, el segundo libro es un libro que se llama Racism.
No idea what happened. Sorry. I just went blank. I
no
hope
problem,
everybody
Alan.
can still hear me.
Yeah,
Jimena,
we can hear you.
Can you
welcome back.
Get back to slides. I'm
Of course. Ready here.
Yeah. So if you can go. So so four individuals and Frederick, in kind of chronological order: Frederick Douglass, Joseph Antenor Fermin, W.E.B. Du Bois, Franz Boas. And I just want to pay tribute to a new book coming out by my colleague Joseph Graves called A Voice in the Wilderness. All of these 4 individuals were voices in the wilderness fighting hegemonic ideas about race. Next slide, please. Frederick Douglass, I hope most individuals are aware of, was absolutely instrumental in US history, was a freed slave, or kind of found his own freedom. And interestingly, when Samuel Morton famously was measuring skulls and talking about polygenism and monogenism and ranking skulls by cranial capacity, there are very few scientists who kind of countered his idea of a racial hierarchy. But one of the individuals who did question it very clearly was Frederick Douglass, and a quote at the bottom, "May not the conditions of men explain their various appearances rather than their inherent types?" Unfortunately, Douglass had little data to go on, so he was just speculating, and he had no non-racial language. Next slide, please. Very similar with Joseph Antonin Firmin, who was a Haitian, who was trained and worked in France. And he argued, was one of the lone individuals to argue against Count Gobineau's The Inequality of the Human Races, with a book published in 1885 called the first ever The Equality of Human Races. So 150 years ago, and really radical notion. Next slide. Next. Yeah, but also, you know, like Douglass, not much of an audience, very little data, no non-racial language. Next. You know, so the prehistory of anti-racism, W.E.B. Du Bois, African-American sociologist, educated at Harvard, grew up not far from where I live. And Du Bois did two things in my mind that were really important. One is Frederick Hoffman especially had an idea that African Americans would not be able to survive in kind of the topsy-turvy world of culture and freedom and things of that sort, and would eventually, their diseases, they would be too diseased and die early and they would go extinct. He countered that notion, but he also brought in, I think, for the first time, the notion of culture as being part of race. And famous quote from him is, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." Could say the problem of the 21st century, one of the main existential problems, is still the color line. Next little, yeah. And next, you know, like the individuals before, he had a larger audience. He was committed to social justice, and he understood race as culture and power, but is also very marginalized and lived in racist eugenicist times. Next. So Franz Boas, I think most individuals here are well aware of, as sort of founding father of four-field anthropology. And I think what Boas is most important for is his fight against typology with actual data, looking at European immigrants, especially to the United States, and changes in cranial morphology. Next. Boas, I think, had a pretty large audience. Commitment to social justice and equity, data on plasticity, and he's really the first person to really understand the notions of continuous variation. But like W.E.B. Du Bois, racist and eugenicist times overwhelmed him, and he still could not separate biology from the notion of race. So he had no non-racial way to talk about biology. Next slide. So little quick summary, evolutionary theories, little help. Next. Individual voices, all African-American. Boas was born Jewish. minoritized, on the defensive, not taking the offensive. Next. And, you know, it's no non-racial language, and this is an age of eugenics. Yeah, next slide, please. So one of the heroes of is Montague, Francis Ashley Montague. Next, or yeah, and very interesting biography. I won't go into, but he was born in East London, Israel Ehrenberg, changed his name and basically pretty much his entire persona when he came to the United States, got his PhD with Ruth Benedict and Franz Boas at Columbia. It was kind of a public intellectual, an insider, outsider. This is a picture of the younger Montague and myself and John Marks giving Montague the Franz Boas Prize for exemplary service in biological anthropology. Next slide. Montague was super ahead of his time. 1942, he wrote the book Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race. And what I think he's the first person to really try to assemble data, for example, on looking at intelligence differences amongst races and showing that this idea that there was some hierarchy in intelligence by race is definitely has a huge amount of holes. In fact, he was the first person to question the whole notion that biological races were real. And this is, you know, some 70, 75 years ago. Next slide, next bullet point. One of the problems, or, you know, is that, so how do you replace race? Montague said, well, we should talk about ethnicities. But then what happens is ethnicity kind of becomes racialized and becomes biologized. So that solution didn't quite work. Next slide, please. So one of the things from continuation to Montague as we go temporally is to UNESCO. And this is the first institution rather than individuals, I think, to really step forward, and especially the 1950 UNESCO Declaration Against Racism. And this is just a slide of the General Assembly that passed the declaration. Next slide, please. So the 1950 Statement on Race in Paris is hugely popularized. Just a few bullet points about it. It's written by Ashley Montague and others, including from Mexico, Juan Comas. It fails to challenge the notion that there are major races. However, it suggests that race mixing is not detrimental. A big idea at the time is the miscegenation. Race mixing is biologically problematic, suggests a lack of information to rank on intelligence, and says that this myth of biological races has caused suffering. And this, of course, is coming off of the Holocaust. Next slide, please. Who drafted the statement? It's only a handful of individuals and people who have really studied the statement and how it came about say that Montague was absolutely heavy-handed in writing the statement, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, just 8 individuals. Next. And then the text was allegedly distributed to a number of individuals for comment and criticism. A lot of these are geneticists that it was given out to, but eventually Montague is sort of credited with writing the final version of the very forward-looking 1950 Statement on Race. So at that point, next slide, please. Lots of information about what race is and isn't, and this is before, you know, the discovery of the triple helix. But then what happens to UNESCO is that another statement, another group is put together the next year, which Montague was a part of, but he's much more marginalized. And this statement specifically criticizes the 1950 statement and says that it didn't have enough scientific authority. The 1950 statement is Claude Lévi-Strauss, cultural anthropologist, biological anthropologist, and this 1951 statement is a little bit more heavy on geneticists and things of that sort. And it also goes backwards in kind of some of its notions about race, including, instead of, it says race mixture in general did not lead to disadvantageous results, and it waffles on racial differences. So next slide, please. It's a 64 statement. This was done in Moscow, and this one I would also consider a bit of a step back. And amongst other things, it includes Carlton Kuhn, who is a card-carrying scientific racist, as one of the individuals who helped draft the statement. And if you can see the book, The Racial Myths, that was written by Juan Comas. And so there are bunches of books and pamphlets that are being distributed at the time by UNESCO. And so UNESCO is really involved in trying to figure out what race is and isn't in the 1950s and 60s. Next slide, please. But by 1967, UNESCO is still writing about race, but now they've sort of dropped the science and they're talking more about things like racial prejudice. The 1967 statement is the first time the word racism is found, and it talks about the need for interdisciplinarity and fighting racism. The picture is from the World Congress UNESCO Against Racism in 2001. And finally, I'll come to it in a little bit later on, that finally in 2021, UNESCO seems to want to go back and include the science. But that's after kind of neglecting the science since the 1964 statement. So for a good 50 plus years. So next slide, please. So moving on from UNESCO, kind of seventh inning stretch in baseball with the Richard Lewontin, another, I think, of the real heroes. We discussed before everybody got on, we were talking a little bit about Levins and Lewontin and their influence in genetics and evolutionary biology in Mexico. Lewontin was extremely influential in the United States and was sort of an unusual individual in that he was a scientist par excellence, brilliant, creative, etc., but also deeply committed to human rights, civil rights, etc., part of science for the people. And he had colleagues throughout the world. He had a 9,000 square foot, roughly 1,000 square meter lab at Harvard in the Louis Agassiz building. Just prolific. Next slide, please. And as most people here probably know, what Lewontin's main contribution to the question about race and human variation was done in 1972, 50 years ago, in a very famous paper on the apportionment of human variation, in which, without going into the math, basically bottom line is he showed that most variation is within the same group or population, and a small portion of that variation of total apportionment of variation occurs between groups within a continent and then between continents of so-called races. Next slide. So just to stop for a second, if we were to sort of sum up 50 years ago at 1972, I think we have all of the data to really show that racist biology is a myth. But we haven't entered the age of contemporary genomics and high-speed genomic computation. That happens in the 2000s. Next, please. This is a slide next of just the announcement in 2003 of the completion of the draft of the Human Genome, with Bill Clinton in the center, flanked by Craig Venter and Francis Collins. And one of the sidelights of this announcement is they claimed that the concept of race has no scientific basis. And reading this myself in 2003, I said, well, we've known that actually for 30 years, but it's good that we're getting some publicity on the first page of the New York Times, et cetera. Next slide, please. Part of this sort of early 2000s revolution is sort of an updating of the apportionment of human variation. And I especially like this analysis by Yu et al. And by Jeff Long that shows not that there are three kind of separate races, but rather that the most variation occurs within Africa, making great sense because that's where most humans have lived the longest and built up greater variation, and that essentially Europeans and Asians are a subset. And so if you can see me, a new model of human variation is kind of like nested Russian dolls, with the big doll being variation in Africa and everybody else sort of fitting within that doll. Next slide, please. And another way to think about it is that it's really location, that the structure of human genetic variation has nothing to do with race, but how different two groups are from each other is a pretty simple and well correlated that genetic difference, or FST, a measure of genetic difference, is very highly correlated with geographic distance. And so it's continuous variation and gene flow being the main driver of human group variation. Next slide. Yeah. So finally, the ninth step is an acknowledgement in the early 2000s to today that what's missing is kind of public education on human variation and race. And if data doesn't move us, is public education the missing step? And this is just an example of somebody, Brian Donovan, who has really been working and kind of developing school programs that put together kind of the social science of race and racism with human genetics. Next slide. There are two big public education efforts in the United States that come out at about the same time and are very similarly sort of structured. One is in the United States, there was a 3-hour documentary, Race, the Power of an Illusion, that's now 19 years old. Myself, Lou Wanton, Stephen J. Gould, Joseph Graves, all appear in it. Even today, I get stopped at airports and said, I just saw you in a documentary. And it's this documentary that has an hour on the science of human variation and is very well used, but a little bit out of date now. It's being 19 years old. Next. And then, as Francisco mentioned, the AAA came in with a public education project. Thank you. That's the first edition. Second edition came out a couple of years ago with a red cover. And I pay tribute here to Yolanda Moses, who was president of the AAA, I think 2003 to 2005. And we realized that really all anthropologists had a pretty general agreement about what race is, what race isn't. but that we have, the public still thought, oh, anthropologists, they're the ones that study cranial capacities and stuff like that, and believe in race and divide individuals into races and things of that sort. So we put together and got a lot of money, $4 million plus, to do a public education project on race that involved, here you're seeing a museum exhibit that was extremely popular and is still 15 years later, is still touring. It opened in Minnesota in 2007. Down the bottom are stacks of money by race. The small stacks, if you can see them, are Latinx and African American. Larger stack is European American. And just very kind of well received. I'm very proud of the exhibit. Next slide. In addition to the book, a website, and this is under revision right now, but like the documentary, we looked at race through 3 lenses, and I think this was very well done. History, human biological variation, and then the lived experience of race and racism. Next slide. So now all of a sudden, and I think really, I call it, it's 2 years yesterday since the suffocation of George Floyd, and 9 with knee on his neck. Derek Chauvin's putting his knee on George Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes and suffocating him, that there's really a lot of momentum towards scientific anti-racism, finally. Many journals are doing special editions on race and racism, calling for changes in how they describe human genetic variation, things of that sort. So one of the things I feel like is we're finally hit a tipping point where scientific anti-racism is, at least in the United States, is really finally taking hold. And I'll compare this in a second to climate change, or human-induced climate change, as that pendulum shift, or kind of change happened maybe 15, 20 years ago. Next slide, please. Yeah. So we've got finally have a scientific consensus, but we're a public and institutions, and kind of like individuals seem to think they have some part of understanding race, but frequently missing the full picture of, how is it that we can have social race or racism without biological race being real, for example. Next slide. So I want to go through a little bit of data on public beliefs about human evolution first, which is interesting. And then this is from the United States. And if you can see the graph, I'll just maybe from 1983 to 2019, and maybe look at the black graph. Humans evolved, but God had no part in the process. You can see that there actually, the majority of individuals in the United States believe that that God has something to do with human evolution, if in fact human evolution is real to begin with. So I put this in because to begin to talk about scientific racism, it's hard to talk about rather scientific race if so many individuals in the United States don't even believe that humans evolved, through, natural history, etc. Next slide. So it's really hard to find information on what public believe about what race is. But this was a study done in 2019 by the 23andMe, the Ancestry company. And the question is, some people think that biology determines your racial identity. Other people argue that race does not have anything to do with biology. Which of the following statements do you agree with? And this is the percent that agree that race is biology. 66% of whites and roughly 50% of individuals of other race ethnicities. So you can see that most individuals in the United States think that race is based in biology. Next slide. I'm going to skip this one. Next slide for time. So a little bit of comparison to climate change. And this first is a chart showing the scientific consensus of 2013 done by a group at Yale versus American publics. And the question is, what percent of individuals say climate change is happening and caused by humans? Pretty much all scientists, and now some people put it at 99%. But a lot of American publics were still skeptical. Next slide. This shows the extreme difference in belief by both party, Democratic versus Republican. And again, for those from Mexico, Democrats are not socialists or anything of that sort. And also by education. And so 93% those who are highly educated Democrats do believe in climate change. However, if you're don't have much education, you're Republican, then you don't believe that climate change is due to human activity. So huge difference by education and political affiliation. Next slide. And this is just, if you can read it, some variation by country. And Mexico is about towards the top end of the top third. Dark blue is climate change is caused mostly by humans. Lighter blue, about equally by humans and natural causes. So most countries are around 80%. And this is 2019 data. So you can see that publics in terms of climate crisis are catching up to an existential scientific idea. Next slide, please. So what blocks this? And I'll say I think there are a couple blocks to belief in climate crisis that also are maybe have to do with almost any science-based existential issue. Decline in trust and expertise, a high mistrust of social scientists, development of a soundbite culture, and also what's called merchants of doubt, which is that there are institutions that work towards kind of confusing publics, etc. And that's really come out of the tobacco industry in the United States. Next slide. So I want to compare anti-race or science versus global warming. And I say this is sort of apples to oranges comparison because they're some very, very different things. But both have a scientific consensus, if you read down. Both have lots of data, but then they vary in terms of a public consensus. Anti-racism does not have a public consensus. There's a little educational anti-racism effort, whereas there's a lot of effort for global warming. There's negligible tracking when it comes to scientific anti-racism, but lots of polls about global warming and things of that sort. It's hard to get data on race, however. And then I think the two big things are in talking to colleagues who are involved in global warming education is that they say that people don't believe in global warming until it's sort of they are experiencing it in some way or the other. And when it comes to race, we think we see race, but we don't. We see variation. And so it's counterintuitive. And then when it comes to powerful institutions, they're beginning to engage, just beginning with global warming, but I would not say engaged at all when it comes to scientific anti-racism. Next slide, please. So just to follow this through, necessary steps from scientific ideas to racial justice. I think scientific anti-racism, yes. Changing scientific ideology, practices, and institutions. I think we've got a good start, but that's pretty much where we are right now. We haven't changed public ideology, practices, and institutions, and we haven't increased racial equity or decreased racial inequality. Next slide. What would it take to take scientific anti-racism seriously? First, I think powerful institutions, and this is just quick ideas. I would love other people who might want to weigh in and talk about this and say specifically maybe about Mexico. I said I would come back to UNESCO. UNESCO has very much gotten back into talking about racism and discrimination. It's made part of its mission. I've begun to work with them. I'm hopeful that we will begin to draft a new scientific consensus statement on human variation. And in March of March of last year, started a series of global forums, and the next global forum is scheduled in November in Mexico City. So I'm not sure in terms of public involvement, but I'll be in touch with Francisco, and maybe we can get some good attendance there. I will be going. Next slide, please. I think education action that has to be early and engaging. I think, with all respect, educating 50 and 60-year-olds is not as efficient as educating 5 and 10-year-olds. We can't do anything without some groups beginning to monitor changes in beliefs and things of that sort, as we have with climate crisis. Next, please. Next. Can you just stay there for a second? I think the main thing is that most people think that racism, at least in the United States, is sort of, if you're white skin privilege, is somebody else's problem. And a couple books have come out in English that I think have done a really good job of showing how racism affects everybody. And one of the books is The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, What Racism Costs Everybody and How We Can Prosper Together. I think that we have to recognize that just as climate crisis, there are certain marginalized communities that will be impacted first by climate crisis. But I think most people realize that climate crisis will affect everybody. And racism has affected everybody. Countries with more racial inequality do less well, suffer greater stress, etc. The COVID affected in the United States, Latinx and African-American communities first, but now is running rampant through poor white communities. So that I think is the main, if there is one educational point to make, is that, that racism affects everybody. Next slide. And I think that's my last. Next slide. Yeah. Thank you. So I'll say one more thing before opening it up. This first time I've done this talk. So it was experimental. And I hope, I'm sorry for the couple glitches and slides and my computer turning off and having a hard time turning it back on again and getting back on. But I think there's lots of things that I would love kind of everybody's opinion, because especially when it comes to how to fight scientific racism, I think we all may have ideas and from our particular vantage point. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Really, and congratulations for this very successful experiment. As you say, this is the first time you have presented this particular configuration of arguments, but I think it works very well to raise awareness of how, for instance, all the steps that you talk about, no, the progressive evidence that has been accumulating, no, even with some turns along the way, no, the evidence has been accruing to really form a very strong body of scientific knowledge that today tells us that really, from a biological standpoint, races cannot be considered to exist, as the scientific racism notions tell us that they do. And also coming and trying to link everything that you told us with your actual work. For instance, the recent books that appear actually in the publicity poster that we produced, and also some of the other materials that you were mentioning. Considering your own scientific trajectory, everything that you have worked regarding nutrition and all the other aspects that biological anthropologists study that do not really depend or are not specifically related to genomics and bioinformatics, that's a whole field of very interesting interactions, no, in terms of the processes that biological anthropologists discover that exist in the human body, for instance, when it comes into contact with the environment. All of that somehow, I think it's also part of some of the arguments that you were developing, no? But I don't know if you have some additional observations on those issues, especially connected, for instance, to, in the case of the recent book that you published with Joseph Graves, Racism Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions. If in this recent book you develop some of these arguments at some length.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Of course.
I can't hear you. I assume other people can.
Oh, I see. Right.
Maybe.
Well,
no, maybe it's about the channels of interpretation.
Okay, the translation service that it's working in Zoom, no?
Maybe.
Right.
Dixa, can you help us? What? Alan,
or
do
maybe,
you hear us now?
Can you hear us now?
Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so I can repeat very briefly what I was saying. I was just trying to highlight some aspects of the presentation and trying to bring things to a couple of new or different aspects of what we would like to continue talking about. One is the content of the recent book you have published with Joseph Graves very recently in Columbia University Press. The name of the book is Racism Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions. So I was wondering if, so even beyond some of the strong arguments coming from genetics, genomics, bioinformatics, about human genetic variation, especially in genomes, no? in the study, comparative population level studies of different human groups, no? Coming from that perspective, but also summing up what's known in biological anthropology, contemporary biological anthropology, about all of the complicated and very interesting processes that happen in bodies, right? At the ecological level, no, in an ecological dimension. So even in one or just a few generations, and going a bit further in longer periods of time, so more in the evolutionary context, no? Many of those processes, for instance, that involve development, no? So ontogeny and ecological relations between bodies and environment, how do you think those pieces of knowledge and researches also contribute to this anti-racism discourse that you have told us about today?
I'm not sure I got the full depth of your nuancing of your questions, but I think that, well, let me start over for a minute. This is from my perspective that especially in biomedicine, when we look at racial inequalities in health as one of the really important sites of thinking about race and racism, looking at life expectancy, infant mortality, specific disease rates. I mentioned COVID. Generally speaking, there have been two explanations. One is that there's some underlying racial genetics, and then only in the last 20 years or so, with developments in biological anthropology, for instance, my colleague Lance Grabley looking at blood pressure in relationship to perceived skin color, as an example. Social epidemiologists such as Nancy Krieger and others, I think Florencia Peña might fall into kind of this category from Mexico. Social medicine coming out of Mexico, etc., has begun to really look at racism or the lived experience of race. And so now is a moment of truth where we have to say which of these two explanations works. And I think undoubtedly one works and one doesn't. That, if you look at the amount of, for example, one study looking at birth weights of African-American babies shows that babies born to African women in the United States, their birth weights look like white babies, not African-American babies, because they did not grow up ontologically, developmentally in a racist society. Other people have argued that, well, it could be a little bit of both, nature plus nurture. And I think that argument doesn't work either, because you can't just have a little bit of scientific race. You can have genetics. Genetics is, can be a cause of disease, etc. But there is no thing as racial genetics. So to get to maybe your question of, is this contributing? I think it is contributing through science, and we see this in journals and scientific societies beyond anthropology finally adopting statements and language saying that we should no longer use race to describe human genetic variation. Let's go to the specific gene systems we're looking at, et cetera, et cetera. But so that's great, but that has not hit the man in the street, the public. If I can, let me just say one more example. Sort of, I was going to include, if everybody's staying with me, kind of an older example. So when the Human Genome Project, well, when we first got to around the Human Genome Project in 2003, and we began to get a much finer understanding of the geography of human genetic variation. A group in Stanford published a paper, Marcus Feldman, etc., published a paper in Science in 2002 on kind of the human variation with the program called SURXE, a very famous program. And what they showed is that if you ask the program to divide human variation into 5 groups, kind of looked like 5 races. But if you did 6 or 4 or 7 or 3 or 8 or 9 or 2, it didn't. And so what got reported in 2002 by Nicholas Wade, who writes for Science, is that this paper proved that basically there were genetic races.
Continental races, no? They
Yeah,
used to call them.
yeah. And so that was 2002. I hope I hope 20 years later that reporting would not happen anymore. But then again, it's people like the editors of the science section of the New York Times are very, very important people to kind of educate.
Exactly. So popularization of scientific knowledge is an important part. No, it belongs into the argument about the public understanding of science. No, of this science that's already mature enough to prove that races in the old scientific racism sense do not exist, but still the communication of this knowledge and of these research, the results of these researches into the actual infrastructures, no, that tell general publics about it is something that's still kind of in the old mode, no, so to speak. Yeah. Okay, so
let me just say one thing. Thank you. But to go back to the climate change example, my colleagues who I've been talking to a lot about, who are very frustrated with public understanding of climate change. But I say to them, look at what's happened in just 10 to 15 years. And they said, that's not sufficient. This is an existential crisis. And I agree with them. But in 1972, Lewontin basically proved, after Montague basically proved that race was a myth, but he didn't have good data. Lewontin finally gave him the data in 1972. And 50 years later, still 60% of the US citizens think that race is a biologically real group. And say, if you want to talk about ethnicities, then we'll talk about genetics of ethnicity, not lived experience.
Yeah, this is extremely interesting, Alan, because as you know, and this cycle of conversations is sponsored by SURXE at UNAM, ¿no? SURXE is a seminario universitario interdisciplinario sobre racismo y xenofobia, right? Which was created specifically with the purpose of bringing together many different expertises to talk critically about why racism and xenophobia still exist in Mexico, no? Which, as you know, many times, many people over many years have said that in Mexico there's no racism in the way in which it is in the US, but we definitely have our own problems with racism and xenophobia and discrimination based on skin color and so on and so forth, no? So reflecting on how the situation is in the US is very important for us, because anyway, we are neighbors, no? And as everybody knows, no? For instance, if you look at the problems with migrants that go from Mexico or Central America or other countries into the US, crossing the border, no? That's when you see, as lived experience, all of these ideologies at play, no? So definitely it's very, very interesting to listen to your expert opinion on all of these topics. And then reflecting on your career and the efforts that you have been made over decades already, no? We were talking before, no, in preparation for this particular instance. For instance, in the late 90s, you published this book, which is called Building a New Biocultural Synthesis, Political Economic Perspectives on Human Biology, together with Thomas Lederman. You were the editors of this book. So for instance, here, there are so many interesting things in here, one of which is the notion of a critical biological anthropology. Can you tell us something about what was the moment in which this notion, arose, and what was going on in that particular academic event that led to this book, and discussions with your colleagues that brought you to propose these ideas?
Thank you. That's a big, there's a lot that I could say there. We wrote a 40-page introduction that I won't repeat, but a couple, I think, important steps for anybody who was involved in anthropology, say in the early 1990s, roughly say 30 years ago. I'd recently got my PhD, and we've always in the United States, talked about, the four-field anthropology and whether or not it's alive and well or kind of being glued together just barely. And the Stanford departments that are split up, Duke split up a long time ago. Harvard, has split into separate wings. And I think part of the problem was that the cultural anthropologists thought that the scientific or biological side of anthropology was too reductionistic and not concerned with the lives of real people in real places. And I, thought that that's the mission of biological anthropology, as I'd say, and as you've read my focus is on how large-scale political economic processes get under the skin, affect us and get under the skin. That's why I'm an anthropologist, with all respect to human geneticists and social epidemiologists. That's why I feel most at home in anthropology. But in the 1990s, there were lots of effort to pull anthropology apart. And so Tom Leatherman and I think we really wanted to pull together the notion that anthropologists who are interested in human biology could really talk with cultural anthropologists, political economists, etc., ecological anthropologists, and to better understand how global climate change or, social class-based inequality, climate crisis, problems of immigration, religious tensions, incarceration, could be understood at best by combining a real understanding of the lives of real people in real places, what cultural anthropologists are really good with, but with some biological information to really kind of quantify and better understand the impact of, various forms of inequality. So we had a conference funded by Winogran in Cabo San Lucas. It was amongst the attendees was Lourdes Marquez, who I'd met earlier, in my career, who excellent, just recently retired from INA bioarchaeologist, and also Magali Daltabuit from Mexico, who came to do her PhD with Brooke Thomas at UMass, and I think came with a sort of Marxist kind of better, more developed perspective from Mexico. And so I think the Mexican influence in my thinking came through them and other individuals as well. And I think did kind of, so we talked about the US hegemony of ideas, but I want to say that I think, Mexico, Brazil, other places in the United States that weren't, I think we're more open to social Marxist, kind of post-Marxist political economic perspectives were very influential for me and Tom. So I can say more, but that's maybe hopefully sufficient for now.
Yeah, this is an excellent set of points, Alan, because also at SURXE we are really very interested in understanding better precisely these academic interactions, that have contributed to shape the traditions of research in each country, and it's clear by the stories that you're telling us now that there is no single and isolated American biological anthropology tradition and also a Mexican biological anthropology tradition. But there's always, because of the vicinity of the countries, this intermixing of ideas and exchange of viewpoints, no, and even at the methodological level, sometimes I guess, no, and I assume. So yeah, thank you very much for opening that very interesting, chapter of the history for us here today. So with Jimena, we're planning that perhaps because of time, also it's good to start looking into questions or opinions or observations, remarks that attendees might have at this point. No, so Jimena, I'm not sure if you'd like to read some of the interventions that we already have in the chat here in the Zoom call, and perhaps also in the other two channels that we're using, no, which is a Facebook webpage, I think, and the YouTube channel.
Sí, por supuesto. Gracias, Paco. En este punto te sugiero, Alan, si quisieras cambiar al canal de inglés para escucharnos mejor. Perfecto. Entonces voy a conducir esta sección en español y quisiera empezar con un comentario personal y ligarlo a una pregunta que nos deja Daniela Ballesteros en el chat de aquí de Zoom, y devolverle la palabra al profesor Alan para que nos conteste y así poder tener un momento de conversación entre las personas que estamos aquí presentes. Entonces recuerden que pueden formular sus preguntas en español o en inglés, dejarlas por escrito o pues ojalá quieran levantar la mano y conversar con nosotros. En primer lugar, quería agradecerle profundamente la presentación, me pareció maravillosa. Le han dejado felicitaciones en el canal de YouTube y aquí mismo. Yo aprendí muchísimo. Es claro cómo la importancia de la educación y la divulgación tiene efectos tan potentes. Entonces, bueno, gracias por esto. Me gustó mucho ver cómo nos presentó este análisis de las tendencias sociales y políticas en torno a este tema en los Estados Unidos y cómo sin duda no se puede analizar la cuestión de la raza en la esfera de la ciencia como si ésta estuviera aislada del resto de la sociedad, porque claramente no lo está. Eso me hace pensar obviamente en México y en las tendencias sociales y políticas que también en este país se están dando en torno a los temas de raza y racismo. Y una de mis inquietudes principales, y creo que también del seminario SURXE en general, es cómo hemos visto en los últimos pocos años un incremento de ideas raciales en las acciones y en las políticas que se consideran antirracistas. Justamente, y en las acciones y en las políticas de agrupaciones que tienen trabajos buenísimos de reconocimiento de la diversidad o de reconocimiento de la discriminación que en efecto se vive en este país, pero que se usan, simplemente se usan ideas muchas veces raciales acerca de la diferencia humana y de la diferencia cultural también en estas acciones antirracistas. Entonces, Daniela Ballesteros pregunta, en México analizamos algunos fenómenos sociales usando la categoría de raza. Por ejemplo, indígenas y no indígenas. Hace poco se reconoció la presencia del pueblo afrodescendiente en México, apenas en 2019, en la Constitución. ¿Esta nueva división puede ser una expresión de racismo o de reconocimiento? Esa es la pregunta de Daniela y quería ligarla a mi comentario y quizás darle la palabra de vuelta al profesor para que nos hable un poco de esto mientras el resto de los asistentes se animan a preguntar más.
Thank you. There's a lot there. So let me try. I think I have 3 points that I'd like to make. One is that I think that we have to, we in the United States have to kind of understand that the forms that race and racism take vary by location and time. I mean, that's an anthropological truism that the Western, history of race and racism, both it diffused throughout the world, but just as political economies change from place to place, there are local variants, and that's why I'm really happy that UNESCO, one of the reasons I'm really happy that UNESCO is coming in, I've been talking with them and having, dialogues with people from India, China, everywhere. And as I said, they'll be coming your way to Mexico City, and really understanding the dynamic. Yeah, if we're going to, just as, it takes the world to fight climate change because it's a worldwide phenomena, it's going to, I think, if we're really going to finally take scientific anti-racism seriously and social anti-racism seriously, it's got to be international, worldwide. About the science, somebody commented, that obviously the science and society are interconnected. The connections go both ways. Sorry, I thought I turned that phone off. But one of the things we have to recognize is that that science has authority. And so I think this puts a particular kind of extra weight on science when it comes to questions of race and human variation. I'm sorry, folks, I have two phones. I turned one of them off. I forgot to turn the other one off. So we really need scientific authorities to step up. In 2003, we saw, Francis Collins, head of the Human Genome Institute, step up. But since then, I think very few individuals have. And I think influential individuals like Richard Lewontin, unfortunately, Stephen Jay Gould, have passed on. And so the burden, I think, is, this is a great opportunity for scientists to step up and influence social ideas. And of course, the social ideas are influencing society. The more complicated one, but I think there is a way out here, is the question about, kind of recognize that anti-racism sometimes will use the same terminology of racial groups or indigeneity, Afro-Caribbean, etc., and use it in kind of fighting, trying to fight racism. And I think that this is one of the places where the publics get really confused, and even individuals who do anti-racism work get confused because they don't understand the science. So they either avoid the science because they're afraid that the science is going to tell them something that they don't want to know, or they just don't understand it. And I think that that's why, in the book that Francisco mentioned, racism, not race, we try to very clearly say, not just use the word race, but always say social race or biological race, to clarify what we mean. And of course, the whole title of the book, Racism, Not Race, is that racism is what we're fighting and what is causing inequalities, not biological race. So I think the point is got to be that individuals have to realize that when we're talking about race or demographic groups or data, we're talking about social race and how individuals are treated, that there is no biological race. Yes, we have been treated differently. And that's really super important. And we identify, and that's okay, and all of that stuff, but we can't biologize it. That's going to end up biting us in the rear end. I don't know how that will translate. So one other point about this, and some countries like France don't collect data, housing, health, education, data by race. And because they profess to be a non-racial society, that they don't. But they are, and by not collecting the data, they can't, again, kind of quantify and understand. Are they moving towards, say, racial equality in education or wealth or health, et cetera? And so that is ignoring, ignoring race entirely as a social construct is, I think, really problematic. The United States has been collecting data on race in its census, et cetera, since 1790, every 10 years. But the United States official race categories is a document, Office of Management and Budget Directive 15, that says, here's how we define the races and ethnicities in the United States. And there's a line that says, these definitions are neither scientific nor anthropological. It's what individuals say they are, which is probably okay, but that's not science, it's not biology, et cetera. So I guess, just my point is that, racial terminology, I think it has to be used, because without using it, it's part of identity. Without using it, we can't track inequalities. And that's going to be, we can say we're all one race, but we're not treated differently. And we just need to identify that those categories are not scientific or biological.
Thank you very much, Alan. And I really thank also Jimena for raising this really, really extremely important point. One of the questions that I had already prepared here had to do with what to do with this coming back of essentialistic notions of human identity, even within contexts that supposedly are working towards the ends that you were presenting. So an anti-racist science and society. So I would just add that, for instance, in Mexico, when we review the way in which even within academic disciplines, many social and humanities, social science and humanities disciplines like history or sociology, when people talk about mestizaje, so many times it seems that they are assuming that there is something about biological races that were in some way pure, that then mixed and gave so the majority of the population of the country. So precisely this lack of dialogue between the biological or natural disciplines with respect to the more humanistic and social disciplines is probably something that has hindered being more nuanced and more sophisticated when talking about this. And even many important figures like Aguirre Beltrán or Bonfil Batalla, when they talked about mestizaje, you always felt that they were talking in those older terms that we're trying to overcome. So it's really something that still is on our table, to continue analyzing and trying to figure out, academically speaking, and then also following your lead, trying to see what to do with those conclusions in order to communicate them to, for instance, journalists or people who have much broader audiences than ourselves, in order to be to see if this is fruitful or useful to educate larger publics about thinking about these issues differently. So Jimena, I turn back to you for continuing the questions from the public.
Claro. Bueno, justamente respecto al punto último que acabas de mencionar, Francisco, Evelia nos deja un comentario en el chat y dice que además la idea de mestizaje supone que sí hubo una mezcla cuando en la postrevolución, más que mestizaje, hubo un forzamiento a pertenecer a la nación mexicana, eliminando la cultura de las comunidades, creo que se refiere a indígenas, y entonces con esto se refiere a que es una cosa mucho más de la identidad que realmente de la biología. También nos deja Diego Morales una pregunta en el YouTube, y dice: gracias por la conferencia. Como observa el doctor Goodman, el poder y uso propagandístico del pensamiento anticientífico, estamos hablando de tierraplanistas, antivacunas, etcétera, o claramente racista, como la teoría del reemplazo, en grandes medios de comunicación como Fox News, afecta la disposición del público, en particular de las personas blancas, a hacer un reconocimiento de la necesidad de enfrentar el racismo desde diferentes frentes. Entonces, también coincido en que estamos en un momento en el que el pensamiento anticientífico, paradójicamente, tiene muchísima fuerza, poder y presencia pública. Entonces nos preguntamos qué está pasando.
Can somebody, Jimena, repeat maybe the last line or so, because I don't think I got quite the question at the end of that nice comment.
Por supuesto. Tiene que ver con la preocupación de que el pensamiento anticientífico, que decíamos, anticalentamiento global, anticambio climático, antivacunas, tierraplanistas, teoría del reemplazo, todas estas ideologías anticientíficas cada vez tienen más poder y más presencia pública. Entonces la preocupación es ¿qué está pasando? Usted en su presentación decía claramente hay un salto entre los facts y el uso de esta información, pero parece que va a la inversa, precisamente, no como una línea donde la ciencia nos lleva a un conocimiento cada vez más emancipador, sino parece que va al contrario. ¿Cuál es su opinión al respecto?
Yeah, thank you. So yes, so let me just say a couple words first about mestizaje, race mixing, etc. And you know, this is a kind of terminology that came out of Mexico and Latin America. And now, it's become much more common in North America that the census finally in 2000 allowed individuals to identify as more than one race or ethnicity. As you probably know, in the US Census, the Hispano, Latinx category is considered an ethnicity, and confusingly, you're either Afro Latinx or Euro Latinx, and it's a mess. It's and I do wonder about all these ancestry companies, and whether or not they're helpful or hurtful in kind of the formulation that you're part A and part B, and those are essential types, and those come together, and there have been some real interesting political kind of debates and fights in the United States. For example, I can say, well, we're all mongrels, and we're all mixed, and other people say, well, no, that that's not what we mean by, obviously, by mixed race. And so I don't think I have a good answer to those questions, but just that I think we have to be aware of the context of which kind of race mixing and mestizaje is talked about, and kind of what the deeper meaning is. Is it kind of essentializing of that there were two primordial races that are coming together, essential races, or is it kind of just seen as, part of cultural change and enrichment and evolution and things of that sort? The question about kind of the lack of linearity or lack of progressiveness, sort of in scientific authority, is, I think, a really huge one. And, that's one that I feel like I'm bumping up against, and all I think scientists are bumping up against. And, in this post-Trumpian world that I find myself in, where, Trump is no longer in power, but I think, I call it post-Trumpian in that the idea that all knowledge is equal knowledge, or all beliefs are equal beliefs. And it's almost like, relativism has gone off the rails to some extreme event. And so there's incredible lack of trust of expertise. And this we saw, very much in terms of kind of ideas around COVID. As I said, so the anti-racism shares some roadblocks with all, I think, scientific questions, because it's one, like, kind of, how to fight pandemics, how to properly, fight pandemics, how to global warming, other existential threats. But then it has some things that are particularly difficult, like this confusion about, well, how can race be real socially but not biologically, and stuff like that. How can you use the terms race but not in an essentialist biological way? I'm an optimist, but this one can make me kind of depressed, because I see us kind of going towards, well, I think, for especially in the US, which I'll speak to what I know best, I think the white working middle class feels very under attack. And they don't, I think, have a good analysis in general of where they're being attacked from. So replacement theory is an idea that takes hold. QAnon takes hold, things of that sort. Rather than just to sort of see that we're all in the same world together, that's increasingly automized and technological. And there may be some really good things about that, because it may mean a shorter work week and greater health and things of that sort. And so, I think it's, it's a trend that, has to be turned around. Martin Luther King said the arc of justice bends upwards. The arc of knowledge seems to be bending down right now. And, I hope it's just a dip and that it'll go back up. I wish I had a better answer, a more optimistic answer. Maybe if somebody else does and can weigh in, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Professor. Sorry.
What you have been saying now really reminds me, or I mean, forces me to connect these ideas with, for instance, what I was listening Anna Singh telling us just a few days ago in one of the science and arts festivals that UNAM organizes each year. This is called El Aleph, and the topic for the festival this year is Frontiers of the Environment. So Anna Tsing was invited to talk about the Feral Atlas project, no? And bringing her ideas about the Apache Anthropocene and well, everything that she has been so nicely developing in recent years with Niels Bubant and other people at UC Santa Cruz. I'm sure you know about all of this wonderful work. So the connection I want to make now is between, for instance, notions that even some of our colleagues have been talking about recently a lot. Environmental racism and environmental justice. How do you connect those topics that are so much discussed among certain academic groups now with the basic questions and arguments that you developed today during your talk?
Well, I am, one of the things I say I'm working on is a piece about climate crisis, so, you know, in which I'm trying to make the point that that racism is not, you know, just a feature or you know, some part of, you know, that of climate crisis, but it's embedded in the middle. And in fact, I don't think we're going to properly face as a globe climate crisis and global warming without first realizing that we have to face racism, because racism, not facing racism, keeps us divided. That's back to the notion that racism hurts everybody. I think what Anna and other people are pointing out is that climate refugees and climate crisis, that environmentalism used to be thought of as a, you know, middle upper class white person, you know, problem, because they did not need to worry about putting food on the table, etc. And it's clear that that's not true, that, you know, communities of color, poor communities, are on the forefront of environmental justice. They're most impacted by pollution, global warming, etc. And so, you know, that I think has been shown that there's a environmental crisis of communities of color. But as I said previously, we're all in the same world. And if we're really going to come together to take environmental problems seriously, everybody needs to be part of the solution, and everybody needs to realize that, to use a phrase, they have skin in the game. You know, that it's part of, I don't know if that translates to, there's a Spanish equivalent to that expression.
Jimena?
Bueno, quería preguntarles al auditorio si había alguna pregunta más para los últimos minutos de la sesión. Y también a Brian. Por favor, adelante.
¿Lo puedo hacer en inglés o en español? O...
En español o en inglés, como tú quieras.
En inglés está mejor.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you very much for the presentation and the interesting information. I also think that through education, we can bring the issue of race and racism closer to popular debate. And I am glad to see that there are more and more books that talk about these issues. In that sense, and Francisco already told us a little about it, could you elaborate, please, a little more on your book, Race? Are we so different? Its objectives, perhaps its structure, its academic or public, yes, rich. And well, from academic scientific education, we can generate change. In particular, I have had the opportunity to give a course in the Faculty of Science of the UNAM on the invalidity of races with first-year students. And the results is spectacular because social and false interactions are changed for more accurate and tolerant ones. We could, with these little ones in the academic and scientific spaces, and little by little change the falsehood for reality.
Thank you, Brian. Just one second.
I just want to say that Brian was a student of our diplomado, a course on racism, and he's coming from a scientific background. So for us, it was very amazing to realize, as he told us, that the students on the science faculty needed so much this information, because for us humanists, I'm an anthropologist, was like, you already have these things clear, right? So let's go on. And actually wasn't that the fact. So the effort giving these courses to first year students was very important, and we were thrilled about it. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. You asked about, this is the newer edition of Race, Are We So Different? And like other thing, the documentary Race, the Power of an Illusion, as well as the whole AAA project on understanding race, that's done, directed by Yolanda Moses and myself. The three main sections of the book are science, history, and lived experience. But I think the important point that other people have talked about is how those three domains come together. For example, in looking at health and health inequalities. And so that's the lens. You sort of a little background for me, and I mean, I think going along with what you're saying is that, what's the target audience, or is there a group that we most want to influence? And in the AAA project, we sort of set out to kind of make it accessible mostly for middle school to high school, which is roughly age 10 to 17, is the age where we thought that individuals would have enough sophistication to understand a little bit of genetics. And I have done work with fifth graders, which are maybe 9 years old, and I found them to be a fantastic audience to talk about it, because they I think they're more willing to see the biology and culture as sort of separate but influencing each other. And I think their ideas haven't kind of solidified the way that, somebody that's watched Fox News for a number of years might have. On the other hand, I will tell you my worst audiences are, and I've spoken to the Texas judiciary, and these are very important people because they're doing sentencing. I mean, literally, 30 Texas judges, and doctors. Sometimes medical doctors can be very, very hard, because they'll say, well, knowing somebody's race is really important to how I diagnose illnesses. And so all this to say, I think educate, kind of even elementary level school children is really important. And, the other book, Racism, Not Race, we did in a question and answer format to try to make it, again, very accessible. And but books are useful, but you know, I think films, you know, thinking about ways to do animations, etc. I think we need some kind of creativity to maybe the soundbite culture. That's another thing of like how to get information across in little, you know, Twitter level things and things that I, you know, take a younger person to understand than me. So that's all.
Thank you very much, Alan. Yes, I think this is very interesting to see how you as a biological anthropologist, hardcore biological anthropologists, are now precisely inviting us, no, to use other ways of communication, no, that go beyond the classic academic paper or book, no. Because we have to face that in the current way in which we communicate internationally, worldwide, trying these other ways of talking about stuff is inevitable. No, we need to take advantage of those technological ways of communication, no, for making our points. So, and thank you very much to Brian for bringing this into this new realm of discussion. And just probably Jimena will say more about this, but we have just been sharing a few links at the chat that are complementary to precisely the explanations that Alan was giving us now, back to the Raise the Power of Evolution programs that were produced some years ago, that I think even if they could be a bit dated or outdated in terms of scientific information, I think that still the political aspects of what you were saying in the interviews along with your colleagues back then are still very, very timely to review.
Bien.
Agreed. Thank you.
No, thank you, Professor Allen. Bueno, me gustaría justo decirles que el material que se ha estado mencionando lo compartimos en enlaces aquí en el chat, precisamente. Y también recuerden que en nuestras redes sociales pueden seguirnos para saber de los próximos eventos de SURXE. Voy a hacer quizás alguna publicación en torno al documental para recomendarlo a un público más general y también sobre el libro. Entonces, bueno, si no hubiera algún otro comentario, ustedes me dicen, me gustaría darle la palabra a Paco para que nos hiciera un cierre y también quizás para que nos hagas un poco de comercial de la próxima sesión, que será el día 10 de junio. Entonces, ¿alguien tiene alguna otra cosa de cierre?
Sorry, Jimena, I think that we can still devote 1 or 2 minutes to read the latest comments that are in the chat. So should I do it in Spanish also?
Sí, yo lo puedo. Sí, justamente Evelia nos... Bueno, perdón. Ok, leo los últimos comentarios, sí, justo, de Daniela y de Evelia. Daniela nos dice, la idea del mestizo en México después de la revolución es más un mito fundador, tiene un fuerte componente político. Fue algo que nos dio identidad nacional y que ponía al nivel de las grandes potencias europeas. Es una categoría difícil de deconstruir sin el apoyo de la educación. Y precisamente Evelia dice que coincide con Daniela. Esto ha sido fundamentado y justificado cuestiones como la supuesta meritocracia y se niegan componentes de la discriminación racial en México. Al mismo tiempo, por ejemplo, el asesinato de defensores de medio ambiente. Como Alan decía precisamente que el racismo está en el centro de la problemática ambiental en el mundo y sin duda México no es la excepción. Al mismo tiempo dice, tengo otro comentario, ¿qué sucede con el reconocimiento actual de ciertos conocimientos considerados indígenas? Por ejemplo, darle más peso a las parteras, a la herbolaria en México. Recuerdo que hace un par de años hubo una polémica en CONACYT respecto a que se tomaran en cuenta estos conocimientos como si fueran científicos, pues se consideraban menores, ¿no? Y sí, este tema de qué conocimientos son más legítimos que otros es sin duda una de las expresiones del racismo en México. Le llamamos racismo epistémico, ¿no? Y creo que es un tema que se ha discutido en SURXE y que seguramente seguiremos retomando. De todas formas, no sé si quisieran hacer algún comentario al respecto sobre los como otros saberes en este panorama.
I can briefly say that as Jimenez is mentioning now, yes, at SURGE we have just begun to look into precisely the problems that, for instance, usually people working in ethnobiology used to study, no, the indigenous knowledges and traditional local ecological knowledges in general. How is that related to the phenomenon of racism in Mexico, but also to different understandings of difference, of human difference, that not necessarily are always related to skin color or to biological traits, no? But also to cultural and even symbolic behavioral dimensions, no? This is a hugely complicated issue, but we have started to look into that. And I think that the case that is mentioned by Evelia in the chat that Jimena has just read is just one example of many others in which even institutions, state-sponsored institutions related to science have been intervening, no, to let us see the complexity of the issues. I really think that because of the moment in which we are in the session, we should really leave this in the notebook, no, for taking note of it and probably develop it as a topic for an entire session in these cycles and encounters that we are organizing within SURGE. So really, after that comment, I can only ask Alan if he would like to close with some final remarks or preliminary conclusions, perhaps that derive from this interaction that we have had today. And really, thank you very much again for your generosity and insights.
Thank you all for your time and patience and really good comments and questions. Though that last little bit, I think, Francisco, you're absolutely right that that's kind of a comment, a session in and of itself. And one of the things, though, I'll just say quickly is that I think this notion that I assume all believe in is sort of evolution and change is unusual maybe in world knowledge systems, and that although other knowledge systems may see animation in different ways, there's a lot of kind of typological thinking that are, not just Western culture, but, kind of that thinking that, and so us versus them, and, kind of, so I think that, kind of this anti-racism kind of will continue to bump into local knowledge systems in different ways. But let me end with, I guess, a thanks again, and maybe a little bit of optimism, and that I think we scientific anti-racism, we have some stepping stones, that are very, very clear. I think it's pretty clear where we're at, and but the road ahead, is I think I have some ideas. I'm interested in other people sharing ideas and thinking this through. And maybe I will see some of you actually in person, COVID willing, in November.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, I mean, really, as we say in Spanish, te vamos a tomar la palabra. We will be really paying attention to next November to your visit and your participation in this UNESCO sponsored events, and definitely looking to possibilities of collaboration with SURXE and with perhaps some of the people that have generously attended the session today. They want to join us for continuing the discussion and perhaps coming with new ideas about how to continue to foster the program. I could consider it that way, perhaps, the program of action that Alan has proposed today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias a todos los asistentes. Por favor, estén pendientes de nuestro Facebook para la última sesión del ciclo de conversaciones sobre raza, racismo y antropología biológica. Estaremos compartiéndoles ahí toda la información y esperamos poder seguir conversando con ustedes. Muchas gracias una vez más, profesor Alan. Fue un placer escucharle y esperamos que podamos seguirlo haciendo. Que tengan muy buena tarde. Todas, todos.
Gracias a todos y a todas. Hasta pronto.